They bet who would dance with the obese girl as a joke. The mountain man silenced everyone. The autumn wind swept through the Rocky Mountain Valley like a whisper of things to come, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of winter's approach. In the small frontier town of Timber Ridge, nestled between towering peaks that seemed to touch the gray October sky, life moved at the rhythm of survival. It was 1787, and the settlers who called this remote corner of the world home had learned to carve existence from stone and timber, from frozen streams and unforgiving soil. Sarah Thornton, called Sally by those who knew her well enough to use the name with kindness, stood at the window of her family's modest cabin, watching the preparations in the town square below. Lanterns were being strung between posts, their glass panes reflecting the dying light of afternoon. The harvest dance, an annual tradition that brought the scattered families together, would begin at sundown. It was one of the few occasions when the harsh reality of frontier life gave way to music, laughter, and the brief illusion of civilization. Sally's fingers traced the worn fabric of her best dress, a simple garment of homespun wool, dyed a deep forest green. Her mother had helped her let out the seams again last week, neither of them speaking about the necessity of it. At 22, Sally had long ago accepted that her body did not conform to the slender ideal that seemed to define feminine beauty in the eyes of others. Her face was round and pleasant, her eyes a warm hazel that could sparkle with humor when she allowed herself to forget the whispers and stares. "You should go, Sally," her mother said softly from across the room, where she sat mending her husband's workshirt. "It would do you good to be among people your own age." Sally turned from the window, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I'll just help serve the refreshments. Mrs. Cooper always needs extra hands." Her mother's needle paused mid-stitch. "You're hiding again." "I'm being practical," Sally replied, but they both knew the truth. She had attended 3 harvest dances since turning 16, and each had ended the same way. Standing alone while couples swirled past, her presence acknowledged only through sidelong glances and barely concealed smirks from the town's younger women. As evening descended, Sally found herself walking toward the square despite her reservations. The pull of human company, even that which might wound her, proved stronger than her desire to remain safely isolated. The fiddles were already playing when she arrived, their bright notes dancing on the crisp air alongside the deeper tones of a banjo and the steady rhythm of a drum fashioned from a hollowed log. The square had been transformed. Torches blazed at intervals around the dancing area, casting flickering shadows that made everything seem alive with movement. Tables laden with food, venison stew, cornbread, apple pies made from the last of the harvest, lined one side of the space. Nearly every family in Timber Ridge had turned out, along with trappers and traders who had come down from the high country for the occasion. Sally made her way to the refreshment tables, as she had predicted she would, busying herself with arranging cups and ladling cider. From this vantage point, she could watch the festivities without being expected to participate. She saw Martha Green, slender and graceful in a dress of pale blue, being led onto the dance floor by Thomas Wright. The two made a handsome couple, and Sally felt the familiar ache of longing mixed with resignation settle in her chest. "Well, well, look who decided to grace us with her presence." Sally's hands stilled on the ladle. She didn't need to turn around to know who had spoken. Robert Chandler, The blacksmith's son had made a sport of tormenting her since childhood. He stood now with three of his friends, Henry Morrison, James Burke, and young William Foster, all of them flushed with cider and the reckless confidence of youth. "Evening, Robert," Sally said evenly, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "Shame to see you working when there's dancing to be done," Robert continued, his voice carrying just far enough that several nearby people glanced their way. "A pretty girl like you shouldn't spend the whole evening behind a table." His friend snickered, and Sally felt heat rise in her cheeks. The false compliment, delivered with such obvious mockery, stung more than outright cruelty would have. "I'm quite content where I am, thank you," she replied, turning back to her work. But Robert wasn't finished. As Sally focused on her task, she heard him speaking to his companions in a voice meant to seem hushed, but clearly intended for her ears. "What do you say, boys? Should we make things interesting? 10 shillings says none of you have the courage to ask Miss Thornton for a dance." "That's hardly fair," Henry Morrison laughed. "You know the answer to that already." 20 shillings, then," Robert persisted. "James, you're always bragging about your bravery. Surely you could manage one dance with our Sally here." Sally's vision blurred with sudden tears. She set down the ladle carefully, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she would betray the trembling that had started in her hands. The music continued to play, oblivious to her humiliation. She wanted to flee, to disappear into the darkness beyond the torchlight, but her legs felt leaden. "Make it 30, and I'll consider it," James Burke said, and the group erupted in laughter. "30 it is. Who else wants in on this wager?" The conversation was attracting attention now. Sally could feel eyes upon her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the unfolding spectacle. This was worse than being ignored. This was being made into entertainment, a joke for the amusement of young men with too much drink and too little decency. She was gathering her courage to simply walk away when a voice cut through the merriment like an axe through pine. "Enough." The single word carried such authority that the music actually faltered for a moment before picking up again. Sally looked up to see a figure emerging from the shadows at the edge of the square, and her breath caught in her throat. Jack Calloway was a legend in Timber Ridge, spoken of in the same tones people used for wolves, bears, and other forces of nature that demanded respect. He lived somewhere high in the mountains, coming to town perhaps twice a year to trade furs and purchase supplies. He was a massive man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to have been carved from the granite peaks themselves. His hair was dark and long, his beard full but neatly trimmed. He wore buckskin clothing that bore the marks of hard use, and at his belt hung a knife that would have looked absurd on anyone else, but seemed perfectly proportioned on him. Most people found Jack intimidating. He spoke little and smiled less, conducting his business with an efficiency that discouraged small talk. Children whispered that he had killed a grizzly bear with his bare hands. Women clutched their shawls tighter when he passed. Men stepped aside to give him room. Now, this mountain of a man was walking directly toward Robert and his friends, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "I said enough," Jack repeated, his voice low but carrying an edge that made Robert's smirk falter. "You don't talk about her that way. You don't make your ugly little games at her expense." "We were just having a bit of fun," Robert protested, but his bravado was already crumbling. Up close, Jack Calloway was even more imposing, and the young blacksmith's son suddenly found himself very aware of his own mortality. Fun? Jack's eyes, Sally noticed, were a startling blue-gray like storm clouds over the peaks. You call humiliating another person fun? You think making wagers on someone's pain is entertainment? The square had gone silent. Even the musicians had stopped playing, sensing that something significant was unfolding. All eyes were on Jack and the group of young men who suddenly looked very much like boys caught in mischief far beyond their understanding. We didn't mean, Henry Morrison stammered. You meant exactly what you said, Jack interrupted. And now everyone here knows what kind of men you're growing into, the kind who find strength in cruelty, the kind who measure their worth by diminishing others. He turned then, slowly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. I've lived in these mountains for 15 years. I've survived winters that would kill most of you. I've walked alone through territories where one mistake means death. And you know what I've learned? That real courage, real strength, has nothing to do with how well you can mock someone who's different from you. Jack's eyes found Sally's, and to her amazement, his expression softened. The hard lines of his face seemed to relax, and something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Would you dance with me, Miss Thornton?" he asked, his voice gentle now, all the earlier hardness melted away. Sally felt as though the earth had shifted beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. Men like Jack Calloway didn't notice women like her, didn't cross town squares to defend her honor, and certainly didn't ask her to dance while everyone watched. I'm not a very good dancer," she heard herself say, immediately regretting the words. Why was she making excuses? Why couldn't she simply say yes? "Neither am I," Jack replied, extending his hand. "We'll figure it out together." His hand was enormous, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but when Sally placed her smaller hand in his grip was gentle. He led her onto the dance floor, and after a moment's hesitation, the musicians began to play again, a slower tune this time, something soft and sweet. Jack's other hand settled at her waist with careful respect, and they began to move. He was right. He wasn't a practiced dancer. His steps were simple, almost awkward, but there was a sincerity in the way he guided her that made Sally's heart pound for reasons that had nothing to do with embarrassment. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to carry over the music. "For what?" Jack asked, looking down at her with those remarkable eyes. For standing up for me? For this? You didn't have to." "Yes," Jack said firmly, "I did. Those boys needed to learn that their behavior won't be tolerated. And you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You deserve to be treated with respect, to be seen for who you are, not judged by narrow minds with narrow standards." Tears spilled down Sally's cheeks before she could stop them. No one had ever spoken to her this way. No one had ever suggested that the problem lay not with her but with those who judged her. "Don't cry," Jack said, not unkindly. "You're stronger than their words. I can see it in you." "How?" Sally asked, genuinely curious. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jack replied. "I know you came here tonight even though you probably knew it might be difficult. I know you held your head high when those fools were making their cruel wagers. I know you have the courage to still be standing here, dancing with a stranger while the whole town watches." They turned slowly on the dance floor, and Sally became aware that other couples were joining them now. The normal rhythm of the evening was reasserting itself, though she could still feel the weight of curious stares. "Why do you live alone up in the mountains?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the attention, partly because she genuinely wanted to know. Jack was quiet for a moment, and Sally worried she had overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice reflective. "I came west after the war, the revolution. I'd seen enough of people at their worst, enough death and destruction done in the name of causes and countries. I wanted simplicity, silence. The mountains don't lie. They don't pretend to be something they're not. There's a purity in that. Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," Jack admitted. "But loneliness is different from being surrounded by people who make you feel alone. I suspect you understand that." Sally nodded, surprised by how deeply his words resonated. She had been lonely for years, even, especially, when surrounded by others. The song ended, and Jack released her with a small bow. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Thornton." "Sally," she said quickly. "Please call me Sally." "Sally," Jack repeated, and the way he said her name made it sound like something precious. "I should be going. I have a long walk back to my cabin." "You're leaving? But the dance just started." Jack glanced around the square, his expression suggesting that crowds were not his natural habitat. "I came to town for supplies. I got what I needed." Sally understood that he wasn't talking about flour and salt. "Will you come back? To town, I mean?" "In the spring," Jack said. "Maybe sooner, depending on how the winter goes." He turned to leave, and Sally felt a sudden panic at the thought of him disappearing back into the wilderness. "Wait," she called, and he stopped, looking back at her with raised eyebrows. "What you did tonight, it mattered. To me. I won't forget it." Jack's stern features softened into what was unmistakably a smile. "Good. Don't let anyone make you forget your worth, Sally Thornton. You're more valuable than you know." And then he was gone, melting into the darkness beyond the torchlight as completely as if he had never been there at all. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sally was approached by several people, older women who offered kind words, a few men who asked her to dance with what seemed like genuine interest rather than mockery. Robert Chandler and his friends had disappeared, presumably nursing their wounded pride elsewhere. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Sally had been elevated from object of ridicule to someone worthy of respect, all because one man had been willing to stand up and say that cruelty would not be tolerated. But as Sally lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, her mind kept returning to Jack Calloway. She replayed their conversation, the feel of his hand in hers, the way he had looked at her as if she were someone worth seeing. She wondered about his life in the high country, about what had driven him to such isolation, about whether he was lonely in his mountain cabin tonight. Winter came early and hard that year. By mid-November, snow lay thick on the ground, and the temperature plummeted to depths that made even simple tasks dangerous. Sally spent her days helping her mother with household tasks, reading by the fire, and, increasingly, thinking about spring and the possibility that Jack might return to town. She told herself she was being foolish. One dance, one conversation, hardly constituted the foundation for anything more. Jack Calloway was a solitary man who had shown her kindness in a moment of need. That was all. To imagine more was to set herself up for disappointment. But hearts, Sally discovered, were not easily reasoned with. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days. And then, on a bitter February morning, when the cold was so intense that water froze in the bucket before it could be carried inside, a figure appeared at the edge of town. Sally was in the general store helping Mr. Peterson inventory his stock when the door opened and Jack Calloway stepped inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. "Mr. Calloway," Mr. Peterson said, his surprise evident. "Didn't expect to see you until spring." "Ran low on coffee," Jack replied, his eyes scanning the store until they found Sally. "And other essentials." Sally's heart was racing. He had come down the mountain in the dead of winter, risking the dangerous conditions for coffee. She didn't believe it for a moment, but she also didn't dare hope for the alternative explanation. Jack conducted his business with Mr. Peterson, purchasing coffee, sugar, and a few other supplies. But he moved slowly, seeming in no hurry to return to the wilderness. When the transaction was complete and Mr. Peterson had gone to the back room to fetch something, Jack approached Sally. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice as gentle as she remembered. "Well," Sally replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "And you? The winter isn't too harsh?" "It's cold," Jack acknowledged, "but I've weathered worse. I've been thinking about you, about that night at the dance. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Sally felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold that permeated the store. "You came all the way down the mountain to check on me?" "Among other reasons," Jack said, and was that a hint of bashfulness in his expression? This mountain man who faced grizzlies and howling blizzards looked almost shy. "I wondered if perhaps when the weather improves you might like to walk with me. There's a meadow about an hour from town, beautiful in the spring, full of wildflowers." "I would like that very much," Sally said, hardly able to believe this was happening. "Good," Jack said, and his smile transformed his entire face. "Then I'll come back in April when the trails are passable again." He did come back in April and May and June. Each visit followed the same pattern. Jack would arrive in town ostensibly for supplies, would spend time talking with Sally, and then would invite her on walks that grew progressively longer and more frequent. They talked about everything: her dreams of someday writing stories, his years as a soldier, their shared love of the wild places where civilization hadn't yet imposed its will. By midsummer, the entire town knew that Jack Calloway was courting Sally Thornton, and opinion was divided. Some thought it romantic, a testament to the idea that true connection transcends superficial judgment. Others, particularly those who had been present for Robert Chandler's humiliation, viewed it with skepticism, unable to reconcile the solitary mountain man with the idea of courtship and domesticity. Sally herself veered between joy and terror. Jack had shown her a kind of attention, a depth of respect and genuine interest that she had never experienced. He listened when she spoke. He valued her opinions. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way that made her feel both vulnerable and cherished. But she also waited, with increasing dread, for the moment when he would realize his mistake, when he would see her as others did and wonder what he had been thinking. The moment came in August, during a walk along the river that ran through the valley. They had stopped to rest on a fallen log, and Sally was telling Jack about a story she was writing when he suddenly took her hand. "Sally," he said, his voice serious, "there's something I need to say, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Sally's stomach dropped. This was it. This was when he would explain that he valued her friendship but had realized they were too different, that his solitary life wasn't compatible with any kind of partnership, that she had misunderstood his intentions. "I know what people say about you," Jack continued, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know how they've treated you, the judgments they've made based on nothing more than appearances. And I want you to understand something. When I look at you, I don't see what they see. I see a woman with courage and kindness, with intelligence and humor. I see someone who has endured cruelty with grace, who has maintained her gentle heart despite every reason to become bitter." Tears were streaming down Sally's face now, but she didn't look away. "I'm not a man of pretty words," Jack said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I live a hard life in a hard place. My cabin is small and remote. Winters are brutal. I can't offer you comfort or society or any of the things a woman might reasonably expect from a suitor, but I can offer you honesty, loyalty, a love that sees you for exactly who you are and finds you more than worthy." "Jack," Sally whispered, but he shook his head. "I'm asking you to marry me, Sally Thornton. I'm asking you to take a chance on a rough mountain man who doesn't deserve you, but will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift of your presence. I'm asking you to build a life with me, whatever that life might look like. What do you say?" Sally couldn't speak. The emotions coursing through her were too powerful, too overwhelming for words. Instead, she threw her arms around Jack's neck and held him as tightly as she could, breathing in the scent of pine and leather and wood smoke that always clung to him. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married in September in a simple ceremony at the small church in Timber Ridge. Sally wore a new dress, white muslin with lace at the collar that her mother had helped her make. Jack wore clean buckskins and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. The church was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness this unlikely union. Robert Chandler was there, Sally noticed, standing at the back with his head down, looking ashamed. She had heard that he had apologized to several people for his behavior at the harvest dance, though he had never approached her directly. She found that she bore him no ill will. His cruelty had, in its way, been the catalyst for the greatest blessing of her life. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the town square, not unlike that fateful harvest dance nearly a year before. But this time, Sally didn't stand in the shadows. She danced with her husband, with her father, with Mr. Peterson, and several other men who had shown her kindness over the years. She laughed freely and felt, for the first time in her life, completely at ease in her own skin. As the evening wound down and people began to depart for their homes, Jack took Sally's hand and led her away from the square. They walked through the darkening streets to the edge of town, where 2 horses waited, loaded with supplies. "Ready?" Jack asked, and Sally nodded. They rode through the night, climbing higher and higher into the mountains. Sally had never been this far from town, and in the darkness she could only trust Jack to guide them safely. As dawn broke, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, they emerged into a clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood against the backdrop of towering pines. "Home," Jack said simply. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over a vista of such breathtaking beauty that Sally gasped. Jack carried her over the threshold, a surprisingly tender gesture from such a rugged man, and set her down gently in the main room. "It's not much," he began, but Sally pressed her fingers to his lips. "It's perfect," she said. "It's ours." And it was. The years that followed were not without hardship. Winters in the high country tested Sally in ways she had never imagined. There were times when the isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight, when she longed for the sound of other voices, the sight of other faces. There were moments of fear when Jack was out hunting and storms rolled in, when she wondered if he would make it home safely. But there were also moments of profound joy and peace. Mornings when she woke to find Jack watching her with such tender devotion that she felt her heart might burst. Evenings spent by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Springs when the meadow Jack had told her about exploded into a riot of wildflowers, and they would walk hand in hand through the blooms, marveling at nature's artistry. Sally did write her stories, filling journal after journal with tales of frontier life, of love found in unexpected places, of the strength that comes from accepting oneself fully. Jack built her a desk near the window where she could write while looking out over the mountains. They returned to Timber Ridge occasionally, usually during the milder months, and each time Sally was struck by how much her life had changed. The girl who had once hidden behind refreshment tables now walked through town with her head high, her hand clasped in her husband's, radiating a quiet confidence that came from being truly loved. On one such visit, nearly 5 years after their wedding, they encountered Robert Chandler on the main street. He had married and had a child now, a daughter with his wife, Emma. He stopped when he saw them, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "Mrs. Calloway," he finally said, his voice formal, "might I have a word?" Jack tensed beside her, but Sally squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Of course, Mr. Chandler." Robert looked at Jack, then back at Sally. "I owe you an apology. I know I should have said this years ago, but I was too cowardly, too ashamed. What I did that night at the harvest dance, the things I said, there's no excuse for it. I was cruel and foolish, and you deserved better. I'm sorry." Sally studied the young man before her. He looked genuinely remorseful, and she thought about how much could change in 5 years, how much a person could grow. "I forgive you, Robert," she said simply. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Robert nodded, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, and congratulations on your happiness. It's clear you found what you were looking for." As they watched him walk away, Jack pulled Sally close. "You didn't have to forgive him." "I know," Sally replied, "but holding on to anger would only diminish the joy we've found. He was young and stupid. He's grown. People can change." "You're a better person than I am," Jack said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No," Sally said, leaning into him. "I'm just a person who learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's judgments. Someone taught me that once, at a harvest dance, when he was brave enough to stand up and say that cruelty wouldn't be tolerated." Jack smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that still made Sally's heart skip. "Best decision I ever made, walking across that square." "Second best," Sally corrected, grinning. "The best was asking me to marry you." They walked on through the town. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the truth underneath. Behind them, the mountains rose toward the sky, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to a love that had proven stronger than judgment, deeper than mockery, and more enduring than the cruelest words could ever diminish. In the years that followed, Sally and Jack's story became something of a legend in Timber Ridge. Parents told it to their children as a lesson about kindness and acceptance. Young people heard it as proof that true love cares nothing for conventional standards of beauty. And somewhere in the high country, in a cabin surrounded by wildflowers and pine trees, Sally would smile when she heard these tales, knowing that the reality had been even better than any legend could capture. Jack Calloway hadn't rescued Sally Thornton that night at the harvest dance. He had simply seen her, truly seen her, and in doing so, had given her permission to see herself clearly as well. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.